The rain came down in long, cold knives across the gray skies of eastern France, slicing through mud, steel, and the breath of tired men. November of 1944 had turned Lorraine's fields into brown pools of misery, and the ancient city of Metz, its stone walls heavy with centuries of war, sat waiting for the American Third Army the same way it had once waited for Romans, Franks, and Prussians. General George S. Patton Jr. stood on a rise overlooking the valley. Even through his steel helmet, he felt the rain as if the sky was testing him, asking whether he dared to strike at a fortress that history itself called unbreakable. Metz was not simply a city. It was a ring of massive stone citadels, forts with walls thick enough to swallow artillery and spit back machine gun fire with deadly calm. Forts like Jeanne d'Arc, Plappeville, Driant, and St. Quentin had been built in the 1800s and reinforced by German engineers until they became underground labyrinths of concrete, tunnels, steel turrets, and hidden gun nests. Inside these walls waited more than 50,000 German soldiers, veterans hardened by multiple fronts, entrenched in positions designed to withstand ages, not armies. Patton looked at these giants with a fire in his eyes. Hitler called Metz a shield of the Reich. German officers called it impregnable. Yet Patton had never believed in that word. He believed in movement, in momentum, in the idea that if you hit a wall hard enough and long enough, the wall would crack before you did. Behind him, the men of the Third Army tried to warm their hands in the cold wind. Tanks growled softly, their engines rumbling like beasts hungry for battle. Patton's commanders knew the risks, but they also trusted him, even when he demanded the seemingly impossible. Among these men was Colonel Charles Lightning Parker, lean, sharp-eyed, a quiet commander whose calm exterior hid a ferocity that only emerged once bullets started flying. He admired Patton's brilliance, even when it terrified him. Captain Elias Grant, a young artillery officer carrying guilt like a spare dog tag, had miscalculated a barrage weeks earlier that cost lives. Cleared or not, the wound stayed with him. Sergeant Daniel Hawk Henderson, a Kentucky-born scout sniper with the eyes of a hawk and the heart of a tired soldier, moved like a shadow through the devastation of war. And then there was Private Leo Novak, barely 19, carrying a photo of his sister tucked into his helmet. Her letter said, "Come home and make the world safer." Words that seemed heavier than the rifle he clutched. At dawn the offensive began. Fog rolled across the fields like a blanket of ghosts. Artillery lit the sky, shells screaming into the gray morning. The ground shook violently, but when the smoke cleared, the forts still stood untouched, their massive stone walls laughing off the thunder. Through his binoculars, Captain Grant muttered in frustration that they were hitting stone, not soldiers. Hawk Henderson watched German machine gunners behind narrow slits of Fort Driant prepare calmly for battle, the ease of their movements making the heavy silence even more eerie. Moments later, the counter-salvo erupted. German guns thundered. Mortars whistled. Machine guns spat fire in sweeping arcs. Men dropped in the mud, screaming as the earth churned beneath the relentless rain of metal. The first assault broke apart like waves against a cliff. Patton paced furiously behind the line, shouting, urging, demanding movement. But even he could see the truth. Metz would not be taken in a single push. Days passed with the same agonizing rhythm. Rain drowned the trenches. Mud sucked men down to their knees. Tanks bogged in the mire, their treads spinning helplessly. Soldiers huddled in cold pits, soaked to the bone, teeth chattering, boots filled with icy sludge. It seemed as if the weather itself had joined the Germans, determined to break the will of the Third Army. Inside the forts, German Commander General Heinrich Kittel watched the struggle with grim patience. He instructed his officers to conserve ammunition, to wait, to let the Americans exhaust themselves on the outer defenses. "No army takes Metz quickly," he said. "We will hold until the last breath." His soldiers believed him. They were surrounded by thick stone, tunnels, and a history of invincibility. But Patton was adjusting. If brute force alone could not crush Metz, strategy would. Patton ordered engineers forward with torpedoes and explosives. He demanded new artillery angles. He had Elias Grant calculate trajectories designed not to break the fort walls, but to blind the fort guns and block their lines of fire. Hawk Henderson hunted German spotters hidden in shattered farmhouses and tree lines, picking off the eyes of the fortress with breath-steady precision. Novak learned to reload with trembling, frozen fingers and to dive at the sound of a whistling mortar. He grew harder, steadier, less a boy and more a soldier shaped by the fire around him. The tides began to shift slowly. On November 14th, just before dawn, Patton launched the boldest assault yet. Shells exploded in a rolling wave ahead of the infantry, pushing a curtain of destruction forward. This time it worked. The Germans were forced down into tunnels. American engineers rushed across open ground and planted Bangalore torpedoes beneath barriers around Fort Bryant. Grant watched the scene breathlessly through binoculars as sparks danced, and then a massive blast tore a hole through the wall. Hawk Henderson led the charge through the breach, with Novak close behind. Inside, the fighting was savage. Grenades bounced along stone floors. Rifles cracked in narrow corridors. Muzzle flashes turned tunnels into moments of blinding light. Novak came face to face with a German soldier no older than he was. The boy raised his weapon. Novak fired first. When the young man fell, Novak froze, staring at the lifeless eyes. Henderson grabbed him, whispering that he could fall apart later. They were still in hell. By nightfall, half of Fort Bryant was in American hands. The other half still fought with desperate fury, but the tide had finally shifted. News traveled fast across Allied lines. When word reached London, Churchill placed his cigar between his teeth and smiled with rare admiration. He told his aides that if anyone could bring down a fortress built to withstand centuries, it was Patton. He famously remarked, "The walls of Jericho tremble again," a line that electrified the room and made its way to Eisenhower within hours. The final phase of the battle began in late November. The Germans were exhausted. Rations had dwindled to starvation levels. Ammunition was almost gone. Wounded men lay in underground chambers listening to the booming thunder of American artillery, knowing the walls could not protect them forever. Still, they clung to orders to hold. But fortress after fortress began to crumble under coordinated American attacks. Colonel Parker directed his regiments with steady precision. Grant's artillery pounded the forts into submission. Henderson moved like a phantom through smoke and rubble. Novak, hardened now by all he had seen, fired with steady hands, doing everything he could to keep the men behind him alive. On November 22nd, white flags began to appear. Thousands of German soldiers emerged from the forts, some limping, some carrying wounded comrades. Others looked dazed, unable to believe that the walls of Metz had finally fallen. When Patton rode forward in his jeep, he saw the truth with his own eyes. The impregnable fortress had surrendered. 50,000 German prisoners laid down their weapons. Metz, a city that had defied armies for centuries, was now in American hands. The victory message that arrived days later from Churchill made Patton stop in his tracks. He opened the paper, read the words quietly, and then a small, almost shy smile touched his lips. Churchill had written, "You have shattered a fortress older than empires, and in doing so, you have shattered the enemy's hope of stopping the Allied tide. History will remember Metz, but more, it will remember the man who refused to believe in the word impregnable." Patton folded the message and placed it carefully into his coat. He whispered to himself, "Damn right." The night after the surrender, the battlefield felt eerily peaceful. Soldiers who had survived weeks of torment finally slept without fear of artillery in their dreams. Some men cried quietly, remembering friends who had fallen in the mud. Others laughed for the first time in weeks, the sound small but warm in the cold air. Novak wrote to his sister, telling her he was alive and hoped he had helped make the world just a little safer. Henderson cleaned his rifle, staring into the lantern light, wondering how much of a soul a man could lose before the war finally ended. Captain Grant walked the rubble-strewn ramparts alone, feeling the heavy guilt he had carried for weeks slowly begin to lift. Colonel Parker watched the city from a window, knowing full well that history books would praise generals, yet the true story lived in the mud-covered boots of the men who had bled for this victory. Patton stood alone that night, his hands behind his back, looking at the fortress that everyone said could never fall. Rain tapped gently on the stone around him, far softer than the storms of battle that had preceded it. "Nothing is impossible," he whispered to the sleeping city. "Not if you hit it hard enough." His voice drifted across the broken walls and dark courtyards of Metz, a reminder carved into history that willpower can crack even the hardest stone if a man refuses to quit. The road to Germany now lay open, and the world would forever remember what happened when Patton destroyed the myth of an impregnable fortress, and what Churchill said when the impossible became inevitable.